So, today on the podcast, we have a number of stories about expansion areas both at Disney World and Disneyland. We're at the point where things are finally getting moving again. Last week, we explored how Disney was preparing for expansion in Florida with new agreements with the government and with permits. And this week, we'll talk more about how these developments are likely to take place in the months ahead. As we ended up last time, we were looking forward to the annual shareholders meeting in which Nelson Peltz again was trying to unseat two board members so that he and this time Jay Rizzullo might have a seat and change the direction the Disney company was moving. The shareholders meeting took place this past Wednesday with at least one meaningful surprise announcement. Following this, actually, just the next day, there were a couple more unique announcements. The announcements concerned both Disney World and Disneyland, which will help lay out where the American resorts are now headed. Some of our news episodes feel like omnibuses in which we look at a range of stories that affect the Disney company, but the current news episodes and news cycles feel like an ongoing narrative in which the Disney company works to undo some of the damage it absorbed during the Chapek era and then move the company back towards something that feels far more like the Disney company that we all knew 5 or 10 years ago. Were there challenges back then? Well, of course there were. But they were very different than the type of challenges we've seen for the past 4 years. And so today, we continue that story about how the Disney company is working to get moving again after Chapek, after the pandemic, and as Universal expands both in Florida and in California at amazing speed. Beyond this today, we have one feature news story about how one of the Disney studios is trying to turn around their theatrical offerings after a less than stellar couple of years. So, if you're ready, here we go. Let's start with this, the 2024 Shareholders Meeting, which was a virtual event that happened this past Wednesday. And trust me, this will be more interesting than it sounds right now. At the start, it was announced that the current Disney board members were re-elected to their positions, thereby putting an end, at least for now, to Nelson Peltz's attempt to place himself and Jay Rizzullo on the Disney board to have some control over the future of the company and, more specifically, wrest control away from Bob Iger. For the last couple of months, we've suggested that this was the likely outcome, so long as the Disney stock price remained meaningfully above the $100 mark, which it has. As I write this, it's at $119 per share. So for now, at least, the company is moving forward with Iger's vision. Iger's vision may not be perfect, but generally, at least in terms of the parks right now, it feels like we have finally turned a corner. Disney Plus has a ways to go, as does theatrical. ESPN, at least to me, still feels like an outlier that doesn't strongly connect with key identity areas elsewhere in the company, and Marvel is struggling, but we'll talk about that more in a bit. Over on Twitter, longtime Disney watcher Scott Gustin reported that in the final count, Nelson Peltz lost his bid for a seat with a 2-to-1 margin, even though he had ISS supporting his bid, and Jay Rizzullo lost by a 5-to-1 margin. That is, neither of these votes were particularly close. As for the shareholders' presentation itself, there was some footage of the upcoming Lion King prequel called Mufasa, also a sneak of Moana 2, both of which we have previously discussed in recent updates. But the virtual shareholders meeting had a few announcements. Going in, I thought there was a possibility that we'd get an actual opening date for Tiana's Bayou Adventure at the Magic Kingdom. In the past, Iger has used the shareholders meeting to make opening date announcements for attractions. Moreover, if the attraction is going to open early summer, we are now in the exact right window for that announcement. For example, on May 4th, 2022, Disney announced the opening for Cosmic Rewind, which then opened 2 months later on May 27th. That we did not get an opening date for Tiana's at the shareholders meeting probably suggests that we are now looking at June, likely late June or maybe early July as likely opening target dates. Moreover, that we didn't get an announcement also suggests that Disney is not yet comfortable enough with the development of the attraction overall to announce a timeline. As far as I know, voice actors are still coming out to Orlando later this month, likely to film some promo material for the ride that is now in its final stages of development. I've heard that as of late March, all of the animatronics are now in place inside the Magic Kingdom's version of this ride. I can also tell you that full cycles of the ride have been happening with Imagineers going through on the logs. If you want to see many of these new animatronics in action, Disney just started a new YouTube series called We Call It Imagineering. The first episode includes mini shots focused on the animatronics for this attraction. In that video, some of the featured animatronics are clearly marked DL, so I'm pretty sure that these are fairly recent shots of the animatronics for the California version, which is many months behind the Florida version. But the animatronics as a group are some of the most impressive figures, particularly in terms of fluidity of movement and range of motion, that I've seen in any of the American parks so far, except for the shaman figure at the end of Navi River Journey. Again, that Disney-produced YouTube series is called We Call It Imagineering. Though we didn't get an opening date for Tiana in Florida, we did, however, get a surprise look at concept art for the Avatar experience at Disneyland. And yes, despite some waffling between Iger calling this project an experience and also a land, in the art it definitely looks like a land, albeit one that appears a little smaller than the Pandora layout in Florida. A land is a well-developed themed space whose identity extends far beyond the footprint of a single attraction. For example, over at Disneyland, Star Tours is a Star Wars-themed attraction placed in Tomorrowland, where Tomorrowland has a general visual theme of near-future living. Galaxy's Edge, however, is a land themed to Star Wars. The artwork for the proposed Avatar Land includes an open lagoon, some smaller floating mountains, and landscape and hardscape that appears wholly plucked from Pandora at Animal Kingdom. If Pandora over at Animal Kingdom was based on the first Avatar movie, this new Avatar Land with its aquatic environment and shade sails for the Na'vi village is clearly based on the second Avatar movie, The Way of Water. The artwork includes the presentation of one attraction, and who knows, maybe there'll be more. This is a water attraction with boats roughly the size of those for Pirates of the Caribbean, moving through that open lagoon. There are no lap bars on the boats, so this is not a thrill ride. It will be a technology and atmospheric attraction. And after looking at it, there were two things that immediately jumped out at me. The presentation of this ride is strikingly similar to concept art we saw 2 years ago for that Moana boat ride once considered for Animal Kingdom. The Moana concept has now been shelved, but in the old artwork for the Moana experience, there was an open lagoon, and here's where the art lines up. In the Moana art, there were 2 boats filled with guests. These boats maybe had 6 rows, each with 2 people, like larger versions of the old Splash Mountain logs. One boat has just left a waterfall area and is moving into the open lagoon, about to pass under a bridge which is accessible to guests. The second boat, which is further along the open ride track, appears about to move into a show building. In the Avatar concept for Disneyland, this layout is repeated only with 3 boats. One boat, albeit a slightly larger vehicle carrying more guests, has just left a waterfall area and is about to move under a bridge that doubles as a viewing location for park guests. And another boat, further along the ride course, appears to be about to move into a show building. The art presentation here has so many overlaps that I suspect that some elements from that now abandoned Moana boat ride for Florida have been repurposed for this Avatar experience in California. Second, this Avatar boat ride needs to be an e-ticket or something very close to an e-ticket to carry the whole land. 2 years ago, in that artwork for Animal Kingdom, the Moana boat ride was paired with a Zootopia attraction likely arranged from the remnants of the dinosaur ride. That Zootopia attraction has now been abandoned as well, but it likely would have been the e-ticket to carry the Animal Kingdom expansion, leaving the Moana boat ride as something smaller and more family-friendly to round out the area. I doubt that this is now a possibility for the boat ride being considered for California. But there is in all of this a very interesting possibility. Some of the most spectacular attraction technology at the overseas parks that hasn't yet made its way to the States is nestled into the Shanghai version of Pirates of the Caribbean, which through screens and physical stages moves guests above and below the water. And I gotta say that the IP of the second Avatar movie seems like a likely way to repurpose some of that tech used at Shanghai now for a new IP, one where in the movie characters repeatedly moved from above the water to below the surface. Again, I have no insider info about this particular development. I'm just going on what's been released and also how Disney likes to update and adapt concepts and technology for new experiences. The big question right now, I think, is this. If Disney does build this, where does it go in California? It needs enough space for a large themed outdoor area, also for a large show building. No doubt a gift shop and a restaurant will be included, hopefully something similar to Satuli Canteen in Florida. I can't see this water-focused land blending very well into the neighboring themes of Hollywoodland at DCA if it's built in the relatively unused area where Monsters Incorporated now stands. This is a development area that might also include the current bus loading zone just outside the park, but on land that Disney presently owns. Also, the monorail, at least right now, passes above that area, but maybe this could be enclosed into a show building. I can't think of any time that monorail track was moved to accommodate an attraction. And beyond this, in terms of simple land requirements for the attraction at the California resort, I think this leaves either the Grizzly Peak area at DCA or some or maybe most of the Autopia course at Disneyland, though Disney this week also announced that Autopia cars would become electric, and here I will quote, in the next few years. So Autopia, at least as a whole, likely isn't going away. Also, just as with the back portion of Hollywoodland, there's a monorail track above Autopia, which could be scaled back but would create some interesting sightline problems for an Avatar area that's meant to represent another world. But this leaves one other option. The Avatar experience could be arranged as part of the Disneyland Forward project, which then brings us up to our next story. Another story that is slowly spinning forward is one that concerns the Disneyland Forward proposal. Disneyland Forward, though it looks like a presentation of new lands and entertainment areas, is more of a petition put forward by Disney to change zoning codes so that the resort can expand in unique ways. The land around Disneyland is zoned for specific use: hotel, retail, amusement, parking, and so on. These plans were put in place back in 1993 and 1994, over a quarter of a century ago, as Disney looked first to build Westcott in what was then the Disneyland parking lot, and later, as the Westcott plan proved too expensive, DCA. In the mid-1990s, I doubt Disney saw any reason to believe that these plans, which allowed Disney to add a second park in Anaheim, would ever limit their future growth. But that's exactly what has happened now. Disney can't presently build a theme park expansion on land zoned for a parking lot or for a hotel. Another example is this. We just talked about the possibility of an Avatar land being built on some land presently occupied by Hollywoodland and the bus loading area. Disney can arrange an Avatar land on land presently taken by Hollywood Land, and I'm pretty sure can repurpose the bus loading area for amusement attractions, as that whole plot is umbrellaed under the theme park zone. But it would need better control of other land areas, perhaps across the street, to create a new bus loading area, which is essential for park operations. Even in this, a rezoning arrangement is essential to move non-theme park operations like bus loading to land nearby the Disney resort. Disney could also build this Avatar land on space currently used for surface parking over by the Disneyland Hotel, and the surface parking areas by the hotel are pretty massive. But presently Disney is hemmed in by zoning. It would like to expand the parks into parking lot areas which aren't zoned for amusements. It would like to build something similar to Disney Springs from Florida on land that is presently used as a parking lot as well. But to make these expansions a reality, they need buy-in from local government. For the past couple of years, Disney has worked to gain community support by presenting an expansion of the Disney Resort as a financial win for the city and the county. A few weeks ago, on March 11th, the Disneyland Forward plan went up for a vote before the Anaheim Planning Commission. The plan, which involves nearly $2 billion of expansion, would reshape much of the land that Disney owns at or near the resort for new hotels, new dining and retail space, and sizable expansions to both Disneyland and DCA, which would be built in current surface parking areas for Downtown Disney and the Disneyland Hotel, with some of that parking shifted to new parking structures. Disney has also agreed, if the Disneyland Forward plan is approved, to invest in affordable housing near the resort, to improve streets around the resort, and to improve infrastructure around the resort as well, such as the sewer system along Catella. To connect up some of its land, Disney would also buy existing streets from the city for $40 million, which, for example, would allow Disney to own all of the land from the Disneyland Hotel over to the Mickey and Friends parking lot without the public street separating the two parcels as it does now. The Disneyland Forward proposal has now passed the Anaheim Planning Commission with a vote of 5-1, which means that it now goes forward with the Commission's approval to another vote. It now goes to a full City Council meeting where it will be voted on again. To prepare for that meeting, Anaheim will host an open house on the issue on January 10th. There will likely be hours sometime that week devoted to public comment. Then the vote is scheduled to take place on Tuesday, April 16th. This vote will determine how Disneyland can expand in the years ahead. In terms of the future of the California resort, this will be the most important vote in at least 2 decades. But as that's still in the future, that's a story for a future episode, though also I'm pretty sure that this vote will decide where that Avatar land that we just talked about will be eventually built. But Disneyland is not the only place in the American parks where meaningful expansion is on the horizon. Earlier this month, we talked about the permit that was filed to set up construction trailers and parking spots at Animal Kingdom. That area in the permit will be a support and staging area for work that happens as Dino Land is remade into a land, as we talked about, focused on Encanto and Indiana Jones. More recently, though, this past week, for a small press gathering at Imagineering in Glendale, California, Disney showed some artwork for a Coco-themed carousel, which some have speculated will be what is eventually under that circular roof in the Tropical Americas artwork. Imagineering, of course, neither confirmed nor denied this speculation, though multiple people were shown the artwork. It could be that this Coco-themed carousel, if actually built, will be placed into another development area, but this brings me to the big announcement from the Imagineering session earlier this week. Disney revealed that they were about to submit a similar permit to move a waterway, perhaps adjust roads and so on, for the area behind Big Thunder at the Magic Kingdom, formally starting the Beyond Big Thunder project, which should be a series of themed mini-lands that are built around the back edge of Rivers of America. Disney once indicated that this expansion, assuming it happens, would be between 12 and 14 acres, making it just barely the largest expansion to the Magic Kingdom in the history of the park. New Fantasyland was 11 acres. Still, 12 to 14 acres is not really an enormous amount of space. That's about the size of Pandora or Cars Land, which are 12 acres each, or Galaxy's Edge, which is 14 acres. It's also enough space, just barely, for a couple of unique themed areas like Avengers Campus, which is 6 acres. I'm hopeful that we will get more than 14 acres in this expansion area, which would allow for multiple deeply developed themed areas, but we don't have any updates as to Disney's current thinking as to the size of this expansion. Specifics beyond this permit about what is being built there are still under wraps, but I will say that many of these things point to some very interesting presentations at D23 this coming August. One of the takeaways from where I sit is that Disney now finds itself in a rather interesting place, where it has released so much concept art over the years for projects that were never built, that there's a group of fans, that is, multi-year or lifetime customers of the parks, who no longer put much value in concept art. Concept art for some now is something that can be easily dismissed, with that group saying, that likely won't be built. That is, concept art no longer implies actual intent. Back during Walt's time, when he walked out concept art, most of these projects were built, with only a few exceptions, and maybe a couple half exceptions for projects that were delayed or radically changed, like the Haunted Mansion. So Imagineering is now in a very weird space. Like the boy who cried wolf one too many times? They want to convince fans and investors that large improvements to the parks are on their way. Only the previous communication tools for early work, which was concept art, are no longer seen by some as reliable. So now how does Disney convince fans and investors of actual intent? This seems to be a problem that they're actively trying to solve. I'm guessing that they have observed that fans see permits as a much stronger sign of intent than concept art. Only in recent years, bloggers mostly have been the ones to publicly announce intent when they uncover a permit filing, which means that blogger frames how the news is presented to the public, not Disney. In a really unusual turn, Disney this past week announced that it will file a permit with the local water management district about work they intend to start in the not-too-distant future on the backside of Rivers of America. They are previewing the permit, not concept art, so that fans and investors will know that this announcement implies actual intent and should be taken seriously. So the good news is this. With a truce between Disney and DeSantis' office in Florida, Disney is finally moving forward with multiple large projects at Disney World. It will be interesting to see if this permit, which will be at least partially focused on water areas, such as the canal and the Rivers of America, will change the existing layout of the park and the back of the house areas. Right now in this general area, roughly behind Tiana's Bayou Adventure and Big Thunder, is the parade staging and float storage area, which will probably need to be visually closed off from the expansion. There's the canal, where the water pageant floats are stored during the day. There's also Rivers of America, which is far larger than the river in Disneyland, whose size may need to be reduced, otherwise guests will find that it is a very long hike from Big Thunder around the back of the river over to Liberty Square, which is what the project is supposed to cover. At Disneyland, a few years back, crews reduced the size of Rivers of America and then created artificial rockwork to scrim off the new developments for Galaxy's Edge from the water. Because, seeing a 19th century paddle boat while visiting Batuu sort of ruins the effect. It's possible, and I would say likely, that some type of river course shortening and scrimming will take place for at least part of this project. I also wouldn't be surprised if the project included a new and very wide river promenade in front of the mansion, which might be one entry point for this expansion area. But the unusual takeaway from this announcement is this. Disney has simply embraced that concept art in certain circles now has the subtext of wild pipe dream, and that unless there's a large-scale foam core model of the project, it's hard for Disney to sell fans and investors on the actuality of the development they're talking about, which is why I'm guessing Imagineering made the unusual shift to preview a permit, which is still not filed, for a water management district, but still a permit they intend to file in the weeks ahead, thereby finally opening the Beyond Big Thunder project. The last story on this week's episode concerns the future of the MCU, specifically what to watch for as we move toward 2025 and 2026. The MCU, as you probably know, is struggling at the moment. Their last film, The Marvels, was the lowest grossing of a whopper 33 entries over 16 years. It brought in just $84 million from the domestic box office and another $121 million from international. About half of that money went back to theaters, about half, or about $103 million, went to the studio against production costs of $270 million and an estimated advertising budget of around $140 or $150 million. It was a major disappointment. One that followed other Marvel titles such as Ant-Man Quantumania that also underperformed. Some industry watchers have cited superhero fatigue, others have pointed to streaming and overall lower box office totals as a trend. Global box office for 2019, before the pandemic, before the streaming revolution, was about $43 billion for the year. Global box office this past year, in 2023, was about $34 billion, which included some non-traditional entries such as the Taylor Swift concert footage. That's about a 21% drop, and I don't see that rising anytime soon. So absolutely, some of this has to do with how the pandemic coupled with streaming changed the way that we consume films. But even taking all of that into account, Marvel has had a difficult year, or maybe two, and is now looking for ways to turn its prospects around. There are a number of factors that have played into the MCU's business woes. The MCU is a franchise that develops slow-burn plots around a single villain or a complex situation, such as with Thanos and his plan to extinguish half of humanity to save the other half. The most recent effort to create a multi-film, multi-series plot was to focus on Kang the Conqueror's attempt to develop an empire. This was the plot that, in Disney's plan, would join up at least 3 years of movies and Disney Plus series. But that plan fell apart when the actor who had been playing Kang, Jonathan Majors, was accused and then convicted of reckless assault in the third degree with a romantic partner. He hasn't yet been sentenced. That should happen this coming week, but it's possible that he'll spend time in jail. Disney, especially as a family company, had no other reasonable choice other than to cancel Major's contract. And in the months since Disney dropped him, his problems have only gotten worse. This past month, his ex-girlfriend sued him for repeated episodes of physical and verbal abuse. At one time, the next Avengers was supposed to carry the name of Jonathan Majors' character, Avengers: The Kang Dynasty. but that production has since dropped his name so that the working title is now just presently The Avengers 5. But the removal of Kang, if that is the direction that Disney goes with these Avengers films, means that all of those elements set up in Ant-Man Quantumania, Loki Season 1, and Loki Season 2 now lead nowhere, leaving the MCU without the type of overriding multi-film plot structure that has made earlier phases of the MCU so popular and enjoyable. But there are other issues in all of this as well. For a decade or so, the MCU asked viewers into a film relationship with some of the best-known characters from Marvel comic books: Captain America, the Hulk, Thor, Black Widow, Iron Man, and so on. Many of these characters connected deeply with audiences, and the actors who played those characters had their careers transformed in the process. But at the same time that the large multi-film plot structure centered on Kang fell apart, many of these key characters have now left the MCU, or at least paused their appearances. At the top of that list would be Robert Downey Jr. He was compelling and believable as Iron Man. He was featured in 9 of the MCU films, but died in Endgame. Another would be Chris Evans' portrayal of Captain America. He was in 11 films. Like Iron Man, his character arc ended in Endgame. At fan events, he said that he's open to exploring new stories as Captain America, but the time for that has not yet come. Yet another is Scarlett Johansson's portrayal of Black Widow. She too was in 9 films, but her arc ended with Endgame, though continued briefly in a prequel about her character's early experiences. It would be impossible not to include Chad Boseman on this list, who died at the age of 43 before the second Black Panther film went into production. But it's not just the characters by themselves that are absent, but the relationships with other characters that they explored on screen. Some of the best dramatic sparks involved the political divide that separated Robert Downey Jr.'s Iron Man from Chris Evans' portrayal of Captain America. Some of the best interpersonal sparks were between Scarlett Johansson's Black Widow character, a character who was trained to be isolated and self-reliant, and Clint Barton's portrayal of Hawkeye, which is a relationship that evolves over many films. Beyond the characters who have left the MCU, there's another group who, for various reasons, likely won't be anchoring a movie anytime soon. Chris Hemsworth is taking a break from movies to focus on his health after learning that he was at a reasonably high risk for developing Alzheimer's. When asked if he would return for another Thor project, he said, "I have no idea. I've said it before. It all depends on the type of story. It has to be something unique." Mark Ruffalo, who plays the Hulk, has said that Marvel will likely never do a Hulk film. In this, there are 2 problems. Universal, in a deal predating Disney's acquisition of the MCU, actually owns the screen rights to the character. Any standalone Hulk film would likely need to be released through Universal, much in the same way that any standalone Spider-Man film would need to be released through Sony. But also there's a cost factor involved with visual effects to create Mark Ruffalo's character on screen. "Well, I'd love to do a standalone Hulk," Ruffalo said. "I just don't think that's ever going to happen. It's very expensive if you did a whole movie, which is why they used the Hulk so sparingly. I priced myself out." Jeremy Renner, who plays Hawkeye, broke over a dozen bones in his body when his 7-ton snowcat rolled over him in January of 2023. He's worked hard in physical therapy to return to regular life. He may not have the endurance or range of motion yet to take on the character, but he's hopeful. When asked about returning as Hawkeye, he said, "I'm always game. I'm going to be strong enough, that's for sure. I'll be ready. All those guys came to my bedside, and they've been with me all through this recovery, so if they want me, they could have me. It would be something." Add into this one more thing. Many of the actors in Guardians of the Galaxy have said that the 3rd Guardians film would be their last, and the ending of that film suggests the same. This leaves as key Avengers Doctor Strange, Captain Marvel, and Ant-Man, who in the ensemble films were never lead characters. There's also Wanda Maximoff, even though her counterpart Vision died in Infinity War. In this situation, Marvel now has a couple of obvious options, which they've been pursuing. The first is to promote secondary characters into starring roles. The best example of this is Anthony Mackie's Falcon character becoming the new Captain America. This changeover of Captain America is also a large plot arc in the comics and likely was planned long before trouble entered the MCU. This transition, I would say, has been going pretty well. This series, The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, sets up the next Captain America movie in which Anthony Mackie will wield the red, white, and blue shield. In this same vein, but landing a little less well, was Black Panther 2, in which a secondary character, Shuri, takes over as the next Black Panther. The second option here is to introduce new characters into the mix. In this vein are Ms. Marvel, She-Hulk, the Eternals, Echo, Moon Knight, and so on. With the possible exception of Moon Knight, none of these series or films have developed a deep fan base for the lead characters. Many of these characters, with a couple of exceptions, were also peripheral in the comics as well. And so with this, the MCU appears to be in a difficult spot in terms of creative development. Many key characters have been killed off in the films, establishing new characters has produced mixed results, and the plot structure that was supposed to support multiple upcoming films with Kang has likely fallen apart after Disney fired Jonathan Majors. For the entirety of 2024, the MCU will release just one film, Deadpool and Wolverine. The trailer for this film is one of the most watched trailers of all time. It got 365 million views in the 24 hours after it was first put online. But both Deadpool and Wolverine aren't characters that connect deeply with the MCU, at least not right now. These are both characters that were associated with films produced at Fox before the Disney acquisition. In terms of live-action MCU series on Disney+, there will be presumably 2 in 2024. The first was Echo, which again doesn't deeply connect with key MCU characters, though there are tangential ties to Hawkeye and Daredevil. And then later this year, Agatha, which again brings a secondary character, this time Agatha Harkness from WandaVision, into a lead role. But more importantly, these loose pieces, Deadpool, Echo, Agatha, don't yet define a viable new direction overall for the MCU. But there are a couple of things just appearing on the horizon that are worth watching and have the possibility of putting the MCU back on track. In the comics, there are multiple Ensemble Centers. So far, the MCU, in terms of the films, has mostly focused on the Avengers and related characters. This proved extremely successful in setting up Infinity War and Endgame. These are the second and sixth highest-grossing films of all time. But beyond the Avengers, there are at least 2 other meaningful ensemble centers to Marvel Comics, and this seems to be the very difficult and slow shift that the MCU is now trying to make. The first of these centers is X-Men, an extremely popular focus in the comics, though people associated with Disney have hinted that the X-Men would be worked into the MCU. It wasn't clear how this would be done until the end of The Marvels, which was a film that very few people saw. At the end of the film, in an alternate universe, Beast from the X-Men, played by Kelsey Grammer, appeared. This, at least for now, places the X-Men in an alternate dimension from the rest of the MCU characters. Placing them in their own dimension might give the MCU a fresh start, and that, I think, is a smart decision. Second is the Fantastic Four, another ensemble center for Marvel Comics. The Fantastic Four has been adapted for the screen repeatedly, but never very well. The previous adaptations have placed the Fantastic Four into contemporary settings, but as many have already pointed out, based on the costumes, images, and props used in illustrations to hype the new MCU film, which won't start filming until this summer, the Disney version of the Fantastic Four appears to be set in the 1960s, which is also when the original comics were set and published. As they are set in the past, this too creates a clean slate for the MCU to essentially start over again, without having to worry about how Dr. Reed and the rest of the Fantastic Four characters might or might not be connected to Hulk, Captain America, and so on. It also means that with fresh starts in the 1960s or in an alternate universe, fans can see these films without having to worry about how these news stories relate to a few dozen previous MCU projects. X-Men can simply start anew in their own alternate world, and the Fantastic Four can start in the 1960s. The MCU has already played with multiversal storylines, so at some point in the future, if they want to connect up X-Men, the Fantastic Four, and other Marvel characters, they can do that. But for now, finding a way to start new without all of the baggage of previous projects shaping these new films seems like an excellent way for the MCU to find a new post-Endgame path. But it's going to take a couple of years to get there. Fantastic Four is set to be released in July 2025, and the MCU version of the X-Men has no production schedule or release date, though Kelsey Grammer in an interview has said that he's fairly confident he'll play Beast again after the quick tease at the end of The Marvels. At this point, between our episode last week and the one you just listened to, you should be all caught up with news as it relates to the Disney company. I'll be back next week with a new episode, one that likely brings us towards the end of our story about Walt Disney and screenwriter Larry Watkin, as they create one of the best live-action films overseen by Walt, Darby O'Gill, and the Little People. As you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories that relate to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us on Bandcamp as monthly supporters. On Bandcamp, you'll find over 200 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. So, if you like what we do here, if you listen most weeks, you can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in the show notes. So, until next week, this is Todd James Pierce.